Two men had shared a hospital room for months. They were each going through serious health crises, and they were both consumed physically and emotionally with their own problems, so they didn't talk much to one another. Death hung in the air. One man was by a window, and every day, very painfully, he had to have his bed lifted so that he is sitting up and his lungs can drain. The man in the other bed saw that his companion could see out the window, and he said, "Oh, I am so jealous you can see out the window. I haven't seen the outside world in so long." The man by the window turns his head and looks out and begins what would become a daily practice. Every day he describes what he sees, whether it is children playing, people walking their dogs, couples walking arm in arm, the way the light plays and dances among the trees. His descriptions are vivid, filled with life and love. With each story, each description, life begins to enter back into that room. The two men develop a friendship. One morning, the one man calls out to his friend by the window, and the friend doesn't answer. He is not responsive, so that man calls the nurse. The nurse comes in, and indeed, the man by the window has died. The other man eventually asks to have his bed moved next to the window, and to the delight of the nurse, he begins to exert himself. With grit and guts, he begins to raise himself up, inches more each day, until finally, weeks later, he is able to get his hands on that windowsill. And he pulls himself up and looks over, and this is what he sees. He is staring at a brick wall. He turns to the nurse and says, "How could my friend lie to me like this? Why would he do this?" And the nurse says, "He was lifting you, giving you life with each story he told." The nurse pauses and says, "And you need to know, your friend was blind." I heard this story told by Senator Cory Booker on TikTok, of all places. Yes, U.S. Senator Cory Booker has a TikTok account where he, dressed in casual clothes, a hoodie or a beanie, and he looks into the camera and tells stories. It's really quite remarkable. So how would you feel in that man's shoes? Would you feel lied to? Or would you feel lifted and loved? Interestingly, this is a question some pose about the resurrection of Jesus. Some feel lifted and loved, while others see the stories of resurrection in the Bible as nothing more than an elaborate fiction or even a lie. To explore this dichotomy more, I want to turn to a bit of Bible study. This drawing from the work of prominent theologian, the late Episcopal Bishop John Shelby Spong. So hold on to that story. We'll circle back to it shortly, but for now, put on your thinking caps. Most contemporary scholars recognize that the four gospel accounts of Jesus' birth, life, death, and resurrection are not literally, historically accurate. The first one, written, the Gospel of Mark, was likely written around the year 70, about 37 years after Jesus' death. The others, Matthew, Luke, and John, were written later still, with John being the last one written as much as 70 years after Jesus died. The later accounts draw material from the earlier ones and also from other stories and sayings of Jesus that circulated among Jesus' followers. Bishop Spong asserts that the author of the Gospel of John, from which this morning's story comes, never intends his book to be taken literally. Spong calls the Gospel of John a book of signs, mythological characters wrapped inside history. That is, the author of John takes existing characters and stories grounded in events from Jesus' life and adapts them as signs that point to Jesus as the source of life and love, the ground of our being. So far in the gospel, the resurrected Christ has appeared 3 times. Once to Mary Magdalene at the tomb, once to the disciples in the locked room, and a 3rd time to the disciples, this time including Thomas. This 3rd encounter is the one Rev Kev preached on last Sunday. Chapter 20 concludes in a way that feels like the end, the conclusion of the gospel. It feels complete. John writes, "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name." John couldn't have concluded the gospel more decisively if he had written the end. But it's not the end. Chapter 21 seems to begin anew with this morning's story, almost as an afterthought, as if to say, wait, one more thing. The presence of chapter 1 is so abrupt, so seemingly out of place, that Spong and others suggest that it was appended by a later editor. In fact, many scholars call it the epilogue. This story is different than the others in a number of ways. 7 disciples are present, not 11, as in the other stories of the resurrection. It occurs in Galilee, not Jerusalem, and takes place some time later, months after the crucifixion, after the disciples have returned to their lives as fishermen, after, Spong suggests, the trauma and grief of Jesus' violent death has begun to fade. For Peter, it's the time to move on, get back to work. Here, Jesus appears to the disciples not in the charged atmosphere of post-crucifixion Jerusalem, but in their day-to-day lives. And he is recognized not as a supernatural manifestation, but over a meal, in the breaking of bread, in loving relationship. Though tacked onto the end of John's gospel, written generations after Jesus' death, Spong believes this story of Jesus by the Sea of Tiberias may actually draw upon a much earlier resurrection story, a more authentic account of what the disciples actually experienced. Spong believes this account describes a mystical, not a physical, experience of the resurrection. But though mystical, the disciples' experience is no less real, no less true. Spong writes, "The Easter experience was so powerful that it transforms the disciples who had forsaken Jesus and fled at the time of his arrest into heroes who would die to bear witness to the life-changing truth that the Easter experience was for them." Resurrection was really the dawning of a new consciousness, the birth of a new vision of humanity, the mystical act of achieving oneness with that which is eternal. So according to Spong, the other resurrection stories, the ones we tell on Easter Sunday, evolve in the decades following Jesus' death to explain the disciples' experience in an attempt to share, make sense of, and interpret the disciples' lived experience of resurrection. This is where our biblical accounts of resurrection bump up against our story of the 2 men in the hospital room. Now, if you are among those who hold an unquestioned belief in the bodily resurrection of Jesus, and I know there are many in this church, frankly, this sermon is not for you. You don't need it. Right? You're holding fast to everything you need in that belief. But those of you for whom resurrection is a stumbling block, and there are also those of you in this church. For those of you for whom resurrection is a stumbling block to your faith, you may identify with the man in the hospital room who felt deceived, lied to by his friend when he realized that the stories he had been told were not factually true. But was he lied to? or was he lifted up with love? You see, the blind man didn't see the brick wall. For him, the brick wall didn't exist. He saw in his mind's eye only life and love, all the life and love in the world. This was his truth, and this was what he shared with his friend. If we accept Spong's premise that the gospel stories of Jesus' resurrection evolved over time to explain a powerful lived experience of the first disciples, to communicate the life-giving, life-changing power of love to next generations, Jesus is the one who achieves mystical oneness with God, who is the source of life, the source of love, and the ground of our being. Jesus sits by an open window to God. Jesus sees no brick walls, but through eyes of love sees and shares only life and love. Having concluded his story, Cory Booker continues, Chaucer said that love is blind, but I don't agree with that. I think people who see with loving eyes, who see others with loving eyes, have the greatest of sight. Jesus not only sees with loving eyes, he sees through God's eyes. Like the blind man in the story, Jesus doesn't see the brick walls that appear to be impenetrable barriers to the good life we seek. Jesus doesn't see the brick walls that speak of endings and even death. Again and again, Jesus rises and lifts us with him, not with lies, but to life and love. So let me conclude with my sermon title. Some of you might know the online word game that has become so popular, Wordle. You are given 6 tries to guess a 5-letter word. With each guess, you are told which letters are correct so you can make adjustments to your next guess. So I framed my sermon title as a Wordle-like puzzle, L-I space E. Like resurrection, some will look at this and see only lie. One big lie. But through eyes of love, what appears to be a lie becomes life. Life that no brick wall can obscure, a good life that has no end. Jesus sits by an open window to God and invites us to sit beside him and to see each other through those loving eyes and to lift ourselves and each other with that love. This is resurrection. Alleluia.